Well, hello everyone. William Davis, Director of Education here for Wilson Daniels, and we are about to go live with Matt Courtney, the winemaker for Arista in Russian River Valley. So we're going to give him just a couple of minutes to join us from the winery, where we're going to talk about specifically the 2018 vintage, all of the things that have been going on with the winery, with the brand new winery. So we will get him on here in just a second. So if you happen to have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat because he is going to be walking us through. There's going to be a lot of technical information and some detail about the 18s. So let's give him just a minute to come on. And I know that it is warm for everyone as we get into triple digits here in Denver and through most of the West Coast. So we will see where he is. Let's see if we can get Matt, just see him coming on. And there we go. Perfect. All right, my friend. So let's see how the connection is out there off of West Side Road. Hey, Shannon, how's it going? And there he
Hey,
is,
William.
the man that makes it all happen. Matt, how are you, my man?
I'm doing well, William. How are you?
Oh, I'm living the dream. Like I said yesterday, working on spreadsheets. So it's nice to see you out in Mother Nature because that's exactly where I want to be most days. So,
Yeah, it is. It's gorgeous out here this morning. If you live in the Western U.S., you know that it's warm pretty much everywhere right now. But we're happy that we have the Pacific Ocean so nearby to provide us our natural air conditioning year round.
and I got to say, the commute's a lot nicer than most.
Commute's not bad. It's country roads, not a lot of freeway time around here, which is just how I like it.
So, I never asked this. So where exactly do you live? Do you live, off of 101 or do you live, closer to the coast itself?
I personally live in Napa Valley, actually. I try to keep that a secret so that I keep my street cred on a high level here in Sonoma. But no, yeah, my wife works in Davis, California, which is to the east of us. So St. Helena in the Napa Valley is sort of midway for us, and we've lived there for 15 years. So it's a little bit of a commute. It's about 30-40 minutes, but it's pretty chill. It's like I said, all beautiful country roads. So it's a nice way to warm up, get ready for the day of work.
Yeah, I'd have to say that probably your commute's better than hers, having to go through Vacaville and Fairfield and all that fun stuff to get on the 80, heading out to
Yeah,
Davis.
I
So,
guess one of the sort of unintended um, I guess positives of the pandemic is that she has been on campus maybe once or twice in the last year. So that's cut down on car time for her quite a bit. So yeah, a lot of remote stuff happening at the university these days. So that's actually not a bad thing for her.
well, we all love to, as you can see, a lot of time spent remote and virtual. So,
Exactly.
there's a lot of people that, aren't necessarily aware of your background and history before you came to Arista. So, for everybody that's joining, why don't you give them a quick synopsis of how you got into the wine industry? Because I think it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. I guess it was somewhat accidental in the early days. I grew up in California. I went to UC Berkeley for college, and I ended up just kind of starting to pick up some shifts at local restaurants in Berkeley. Just as a kid, trying to earn a little extra spending money. I started out as a line cook, just at a hoagie shop in Berkeley, um, and over the next few years, just kind of fell in love with the restaurant industry, and pretty much had every job you can think of in the restaurant world. Ended up working in almost every restaurant in Berkeley over the course of the next 4 years. Ended up at Chez Panisse, worked there for quite a while. Kind of fell in love with fine food and fine wine, working at Chez, and started gravitating more toward the wine side of the equation. And worked as a somm for a few years before I decided to sort of jump to a different track and dive into production. So I moved. I was living in Jackson Hole at the time, Wyoming, and moved back to California, and just started cold calling wineries and winemakers. And went back to school. So was working in the cellar and went back to school at the same time, got my degree at Davis, and then got hired straight out of Davis at working for Helen Turley. So worked for her making Cabernet in Napa Valley, and then ultimately making Pinot Noir and Chardonnay at Marcassin for about 8 years. So that led me to, about 2012, at which point I had the fortuitous meeting with Mark McWilliams and McWilliams family, and then started here in 2013 when we decided that we really wanted to work together, and there were a lot of sort of serendipitous connections that we had, and we thought we could make something great here. So that was 8 years ago.
So do you think that the serendipity that you have with the McWilliams, was that more about, the people that you knew, or was it about vineyard sourcing? What was it that drew you to Arista?
Yeah, it's probably all of the above. We were sort of in the same part of our lives. In other words, the McWilliams had sort of done all the right things to lay the groundwork for something great. They'd been farming grapes in Sonoma since the 80s, and had finally decided to start their own brand, and had made so many great relationships throughout their time growing with all of these really sort of the cream of the crop in terms of growers in Sonoma County. They had all of these amazing vineyard sources lined up. The one missing piece was just the winemaking. And for me, I really, really wanted to do a long sort of old school apprenticeship style at Marcassin, which isn't that common anymore. I feel like people are less willing to kind of wait that long to do something. But for me, it was really important. And it was one of the reasons I switched from restaurants to production, was this idea that I was getting from the winemakers that I'd been meeting in the US and in Europe, of this sort of long-term commitment to the sites they were working with, to the brands that they worked for, that I wasn't seeing as much in the restaurant world. So it was this combination of the McWilliams sort of long-term approach to everything that I really, really loved. This idea that they had all of these really extremely high-level vineyard sources at their disposal, and it was kind of the perfect opportunity for me just to take everything that I had been working on at Marcassin and start this amazing new brand in the heart of the Russian River Valley, with all this potential, really. And so it was kind of this amazing, once in a lifetime, diamond in the rough opportunity, that just seemed like Mark, Ben, and myself, we'd all come to have this sort of dinner where we all met at this one time where everything was kind of aligning, all the stars were aligning. So yeah, all that stuff just seemed to be the right place at the right time.
Now, you talked about, 8 years with Marcusson, and, we see the winery, the brand new winery directly behind you. And that really ties in to the 2018 vintage, because that was the first vintage that was made exclusively in the winery. Because, what were some of the things you learned in custom crush, between 2012 and then 2018? Because you want to walk in and actually show us a couple of things, right?
Yeah, definitely. I thought we'd take a little Instagram tour of the winery, and then talk about the 18s at the same time. I think it's a good dovetailing two topics. Um, we were very fortunate to, while we were planning and designing this winery, to have the opportunity to make wine at Ulysses Valdez facility in the interim. So Ulysses had planted this property in 2006, and he had farmed it ever since. We also worked with Ulysses on a few other of the sites we were buying grapes from. So we were really tight with Ulysses, and it was also incredible and generous of him to allow us to make the wines at his facility while we were building this one. So we were very tight with him, and that was a special sort of arrangement we had that worked out wonderfully. But of course, there's nothing quite like having your own purpose-built facility that you designed from the ground up. That's 10 meters away from our estate vineyard here. There's nothing quite that can compare to that. So yeah, we knew exactly what we wanted in the facility when we started designing it. I had just finished building the Marcusson winery that we moved into in 2011. So, we finished this facility in 17. So at that point, I'd been building wineries for like 6 years straight, and I was very happy to be no longer in the construction business when we finally finished this one. But yeah, it's pretty special. So right now we're standing on top of the barrel rooms. They're underground, which is a huge boon for us. The barrels are kept at almost perfect temperature and humidity year round. We do have the ability to actively cool and humidify, but those are just we're able to use those processes as just kind of fine tuning. It stays naturally pretty cool year round. This middle level here is just our offices. Top level is a 2-bedroom hospitality suite. So next time you're out here, William, we'll have to have you stay with us. Hopefully you're okay with speed metal being played in the cellar all day long, but
I'm
here you are.
Okay with that. Yeah. Yeah. As long as it's not played at 3 a.m.
Okay, we'll shut it off for you. But
yeah,
so let's see. We can take a little walk through. Obviously, as you saw, sort of a modern barn design, which we think fits nicely with the aesthetic of the Russian River Valley. Just a little tour of the offices. Little map of the requisite map of Burgundy. We have to have that.
Snap behind me as well. So
that's right. So then, we have our tank room. As you can see, all the Pinot is made in open-top stainless steel tanks. Fairly small tanks. These little guys on the end are about 1 ton, and then the middle guys are 3 and 4 tons. So, it's just the nature of, I think, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. The vineyards are small, blocks are small. We keep the vineyards and the blocks separate. Obviously, the tradition is to bottle things as vineyard designates, and so we certainly honor that tradition. And as you know, apart from our appellation wines, everything is vineyard designated here as well. And then barrel room. So, yeah, I mean, we have all the fancy tools now, which hasn't changed our approach and our philosophy. Really, it just allows us now to make wines even more according to what we've always wanted to do. So yeah, there's a lot of technology in the winery. It's all in how we really control temperature and can observe the fermentations in the wines. When we actually go to work with the wines or touch the wines, it's very low tech. So it's a perfect combination for us to really, I mean, I don't know, maybe you can tell the aesthetic is very minimal. And I think that carries through to the winemaking. It's a very minimalistic approach. Getting back to what we were talking about earlier, the McWilliams had done such an amazing job gathering these, what we think of as, Grand Cru level vineyards of the Sonoma County and Russian River Valley specifically. We want to make the winemaking such that it showcases those sites. We don't want to use heavy-handed or very impactful winemaking technique to have a big thumbprint on the wines. We want the sites themselves to be able to express their unique characteristics as transparently as possible. So everything we do here is geared toward that. That means we keep the winery exceptionally clean. That way we can maximize the potential for the native yeasts that live in these specific sites to actually carry out the fermentations. If we had more of a robust native yeast population that was living in the winery, that would be masked and we'd have more of a cellar character to the wines. We really do want each of these wines to be a unique individual. And so we feel that allowing those fermentations to happen based on those unique combinations of strains that come from each of these sites to carry out those fermentations, that's going to help us ensure that those wines are individuals and that there's a purpose for each of the bottlings that we have. We don't want, 10 different Pinot Noirs that all taste the same because we're inoculating with some commercial yeast or we're blending things together. We want each one to stand on its own and be a unique individual. So these barrel rooms are small. They're small and we actually keep them quite cold year round. That's one of the benefits of having our own facility. The barrel rooms are 54 degrees year round, which is on the colder side. And it means combined with our use of native ferments, it means fermentations take a long time. We're standing in the Chardonnay room right now. It's not uncommon for these wines to ferment for a full year before they go completely dry. And we think that slow, gradual, very cool fermentation is what allows us to capture these very fragile and nuanced aromatic components that we want to show up in the glass. If we had a warmer cellar, if the fermentations were faster and more vigorous, it would allow me to sleep better through most of the year. But we think that it would detract from the overall quality of the wines. So yeah, same with Pinot Noir. The Pinot, malolactic fermentation in a cold cellar like this will take up to a full year as well. But we think that has obvious benefits, too. Speaking of the 18 wines, ML finished for really without exception in July, late June and early July for all of the wines.
Wow.
Which means, we basically didn't sulfur anything until the day before bottling. And for me, that means, if I'm having to sulfur the wines all year long because I have a fast fermentation and a fast ML that finishes in December, now I'm having to protect that wine with multiple sulfur adds throughout élevage. Now with our cellar being so cold, and with our delayed ML, we're sulfuring the wine one time before bottling, and so much less sulfur use means super fresh wines, means much more vibrant, lively wines. Not a wine that's been sort of hammered with sulfur over the last 12 months. So again, all these little things aren't huge shifts in our approach, but they're refinements of the philosophy we've had all along.
So, there are a couple of questions that I always have regarding that. Do you think that, longer fermentations are attributable to specific vintages? Thinking about the 18s versus the 17s or even the 16s, where it may have been a little shorter in that time. Do you attribute that to, the numbers as they come in, the overall ripeness levels, or have you started to see a change in those native populations that you had at UV, for example, to what you have now in the new winery?
Let's see. I think for sure vintage has a role to play, and I don't know the full story. I don't think it's as simple as sugar levels or even acid levels. I think it's probably more to do with smaller variations in wine chemistry, maybe stuff that we're not even measuring. Typically, I think of nutrition, like yeast nutrition, as a big one. Every vintage is going to have its own sort of mix of, obviously juice, even from a specific site, is going to have different or juice chemistry year to year. And we can only measure so many components in that juice. There are certainly, hundreds of compounds in the juice that could affect yeast metabolism in different ways. So for sure it comes down to vintage variation. What we do know is that when you're using fully native yeasts and you don't have any, commercial yeast in your facility, and we know this relatively well. We've done the DNA testing on juice and wine samples and run the analysis, and every time we've done it, we've found that we don't have any we don't have any commercial strains in any of the wines. So it's not like we think we have native ferments, but really there's a winery full of commercial yeasts that are actually doing the fermentations. We actually look at this on almost a yearly basis, and we've never found any commercial strains in the barrels, whether that be up at Ulysses facility or here. And this is work that we started at Marcusson and we've continued to do here, just so we know what we're actually dealing with in terms of the yeast populations. So yeah, I think it's every wine has a different combination of strains. When we've looked at down to the strain level, we see that we have 20, 30, 40, sometimes more than 50 different strains of yeast in these native ferments. And each one of those combinations is going to ferment at a different rate, ferment with a different, flavor impact, aromatic impact. But I think the one thing that is consistent in terms of fermentation rate, so how long a fermentation will take, is temperature. So it gets back to my original point, which is now at the new winery, having the ability to really dial in cellar temp and keep it consistently cool throughout the year is the one thing that allows us to control fermentation rate more than anything else.
I see. Well, again, it's always fascinating, right? Because you're always trying to figure out, is there some type of correlation, in similar yeast strains from one location to the next? and how they affect, the fermentation process, and the organoleptic, finality of those wines. Now, in your opinion, though, what makes 2018 special as a vintage?
So 18, I guess there's three main things that happened in 18. So the new winery is the most obvious. We also brought farming in-house. So Ulysses had planted the vineyard in '06, and he'd been farming it all the way up until 2017 when we took farming over ourselves. And in the same sense as there's nothing like having your own facility to make wine in, regardless of how great your sort of custom crush situation is. Kind of the same thing with farming. There's no matter how good Ulysses is, there's nothing like doing the farming yourself. So we started in 17. 18 was when we really started to see the first benefits of bringing the farming in-house on the estate. And then combine that with the vintage character itself. So if you think I always think of the block of 2012 through 17, being a block of increasingly dry and warm vintages, which led to, it's a string of vintages that did really well critically. The wines were really impressive in terms of concentration and color and scale. But there's a limit, I think, to how far you can turn that dial. And I think for us to see, the sort of normal rainfall come back in the winter of 17, 18, actually average to greater than average rainfall, was really a welcome shift in the sort of string of vintages we'd seen. Even walking vineyards in 2018, you could notice visually how much different everything looked. Vineyards looked much more vibrant, healthy. Everything looked just refreshed from the sort of just the amount of rainfall we got in over the winter. And that really, I think, translates into the wines themselves. The wines, while 17, if you think about 17, the wines are just big in scale, they're dark, and again, like high scoring, but I think 18's, everything is just, to use the word we all love, everything's so much more in balance in 18. The wines are so much fresher and so much more drinkable in my mind. So yeah, I think 18 is a really return to balance and freshness and energy in the wines. So at 18, 19 is similar in that regard. A lot of freshness, another quite cool vintage in 19. So it's two back-to-back, I think, really exceptional vintages. 19 maybe has a bit more structure. I kind of think of 18 and 19 like I do of 12 and 13, where 12 came out with a lot of fanfare. Again, the wines were dark, delicious, but the word we often use for 12 is charming. So really drinkable wines, but in hindsight, 13 I think had everything that 12 did, but with the added benefit of really nice structure. So I think 12 ended up being a more ageable vintage, 13 ended up being a more ageable vintage of those two. And I think the same will play out with 18 and 19, where 18, the wines are delicious right now, exceptional. 19, similar to 18, just with a bit more structure. So yeah, the 18s, I kind of, after working on a wine for, growing the grapes and then working with a wine for 18 months and then bottling the wine, I kind of have to walk away for a little while, get some distance. And now that I'm going back through the 18s, it's been just amazing to start pulling those corks again and remembering those wines and reliving that vintage, because they're really exciting wines, as I said, just because of the vibrancy in the glass, and it's pretty fun to drink those wines.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I mean, one thing about, having tasted the 18s over the past couple of months, there's a freshness to the wines. The wines are pretty, where they don't necessarily show any of that hydric stress, like you mentioned, that you found in vintages like 14 or 15. Um, and it's funny how you mentioned, how the 13s are, you know, they're broad, but they still hadn't gotten to that full drought cycle that
Right.
we saw early on. Um, there was a question. How often do you taste the fermentations as it's going through that, year-long process?
So yeah, let's say during the heat of harvest, of course we are tasting every single lot multiple times a day. We're tasting because things are happening so fast. We need to be making decisions on a hour by hour, if not minute by minute basis as the wines are changing. Obviously, we're looking mostly at the kinetics of extraction in the tanks. We kind of know just based on numbers where the chemistry is going. That's kind of a foregone conclusion. All the wines are going to be dry, so we know just based on initial numbers where the wines are going to end up from a chemical perspective. So really we're focused on flavors, aromatics, and textures during the heat of fermentation. And that happens really fast over the course of 3 weeks. And we need to be on it to determine how we're going to move the wine, basically to distribute, the increasing amount of heat that the yeast are creating. We want to be able to sort of manage textures and tannins, and that means, and those kind of extraction curves are really steep at that time of year. So we're tasting just constantly. Same with the time period right after pressing. So we'll press pretty close to dryness. I don't like to press all the way dry. I do like the wine going into barrel with quite a bit of activity still in the wine, so that the yeast can help the wine marry with the barrel. I don't like completely dry wine into barrel. I think you risk sort of an awkward marriage of wine and barrel if there's really zero activity left in the wine. So we like to put active wine in the barrel to help with that marriage. And then once the wine's in barrel and put into the cellar, the winemaking becomes very boring after that. I mean, we're really leaving the wine alone, whether it's Pinot Noir or Chardonnay. It's a very slow process from then on. The remaining sugars are being fermented by the yeast. That can take another couple of months in Pinot Noir, and like I said, up to a year in Chardonnay. And then as ML kicks in with Pinot and Chard, that's an extremely slow process. So at that point, we're topping pretty much every week. And so we'll take the opportunity to taste on a weekly basis. We don't want to be at that point constantly opening the barrels, pulling the bungs, because we start to get worried about the introduction of air into the wine at that point. So our opportunities to taste really start to decrease. So we're more on a weekly basis at that point. And then once ML is done, we'll shift gears into starting to get a feel for what the vintage has given us. It's hard to really get a grasp for what a finished wine is going to really give you until it's all the way through ML and really settled. Cloudy wine is, as you probably know, difficult to really get a feel for. Those suspended solids can really mute flavors and aromas. So once ML is done and the wine starts to clarify, we can really go back, start to assess the vintage, and then start to come up with an initial thought for blends. And then we shift into, instead of tasting as much in the cellar, we'll start pulling samples out of barrel and tasting up at the table upstairs in a setting where we have a proper wine glass. The wine has a chance to aerate. And so we're more assessing what that wine will be as a finished wine at that point, and start to put blends together. Obviously, we're not blending in the kind of Bordeaux style where we're blending different vineyards together or blocks together. We're really at that point looking at barrel combinations. So if I have a lot of 8 barrels of Ritchie Vineyard, I want to know, because we're starting out with, let's say, 25% new oak. So it's 2 out of the 8 barrels are new. Now I need to know in this vintage how much new oak can Ritchie Vineyard take. Some vintages maybe it's 38%, in another vintage it might be 25%. And so we start looking at what that final blend will be if we need to kick out any new barrels into the Russian River blend, if we need to kick out any neutral barrels into the Russian River Valley blend. So we're looking at those combinations of blends at that point until we keep doing it until we have the final blend. So it kind of, the purpose of tasting and the frequency of tasting shifts throughout the course of the life of the wine. Certainly the most intense period is during those initial weeks of fermentation, and then it kind of slows down from there.
So it's really more your perception and interpretation of what the vineyard should taste like before it is then, moved to the Russian River. So in your eyes, what should Russian River Chardonnay and Pinot Noir taste like? What are the characteristics and the typicity of those?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because I think there's 2 things that I'm always looking for personally. I want certainly there to be this through line that shows off the typical character of those 2 varieties in the Russian River Valley. I think there is a character I want to run through all the wines, but I don't want to homogenize from vintage to vintage. The whole purpose of doing things this way and the whole purpose of drinking Pinot Noir and Chardonnay is that it's so sensitive to these changes in site, and it's so sensitive to these changes in vintage that I want to make sure the wine is reflective of those changes and honest representation of the Russian River Valley in that vintage. So if you taste, an Arista, Russian River Valley Pinot Noir or a Chardonnay, that appellation wine should give you a really clear insight into the vintage from that vintage from that appellation. For me, Pinot Noir from Russian River Valley needs to be certainly fully ripe, always lots of crushed berry. I personally I like this in Burgundy too, a note of cola in the wines. It's kind of a sweet roasted kind of character. There needs to be some movement in the wine. And in other words, when you're experiencing the wine over the course of 10 or 15 or 60 minutes, my favorite wines are the wines that every time you go back to the glass, you're discovering something new about that wine. So the way we make wines, oftentimes the wines can be a little tight at first for the first year or so, or the first few minutes out of the bottle. But with some patience, those wines really evolve over the course of an hour or so in the glass. I think Russian River Valley, the benefit or the hallmark, the reason it's a world famous region at this point is because the wines can be very serious. They can be very layered. We have typically an abundance of sunshine in the Russian River Valley. So the job of the winemaker is really to mitigate the inherent power of the wines And for me, it's really to preserve freshness and energy. It's one of the reasons for Sonoma Coast wines, I'll often allow the wines to rest in barrel for 18 months before bottling. But Russian River Valley, I feel like there's already an inherent drinkability to the wines. So my job is to capture freshness. So we bottle all the Pinots after a 12-month élevage, with the risk of the wines being a little tight and a little young at first. But I think tension, energy, freshness has to be the main goal for Russian River Valley. And when you can catch it just right, I mean, the wines are just spectacular.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why, we're releasing the 2018 vintage, where you see a lot of producers that are already rolling into their 19s.
Right.
We've got the wines that are going to be ready in the next few days, literally the next few days, and they're going to be coming out to the markets across the United States. What are some of the vineyards that really speak to you now, that are kind of like, surprising standouts?
Let's see. For me, that's a good question. We have a mix of back to the work that the McWilliams had done even before I got here. Some obviously very famous vineyards that we're able to pull fruit from. Those it's hard to say those are ever surprisingly good, because they're obviously good. I mean, people have been making great wines from Ritchie Vineyard for before I was even born. So those,
he does.
Yeah. So when Ritchie is great, it's no surprise. I think I'm looking for the nuance in that wine. I'm expecting it to be great. I'm more interested in the the smaller details. For example, with Ritchie, I think, we often harvest out of that vineyard before most other people. So it's always interesting to me to see the mineral quality of that wine, the brightness in that wine, when a lot of the sort of Ritchies historically have been these huge scale examples. So it's cool for me to see what a vineyard like that can do when it's pulled back a little bit in terms of power. It already has this inherent opulence. And so to pull back a little on the style and have it be this really focused, very mineral version, that's what's really interesting for me in vineyards that are of that kind of pedigree. So for other vineyards that are maybe newer, like let's look at El Diablo, for example. That's a vineyard that's only about 15 years old at this point. But every year that goes by now, we're into this kind of mature window for that vineyard. When we started working with it, it was still quite a young vineyard, 9-10 years old. Now that it's 15, 16 years old, every year that goes by, it's sort of mind-blowing. That doesn't happen as much in a 50-year-old vineyard like Ritchie. It's more well settled into its sort of old age and consistency. But something like El Diablo, it's crazy to see it just elevate year after year into this exceptional site that can absolutely stand up with a vineyard like Ritchie Vineyard. Other producers are getting fruit. I'm not the only one. Marco Bear is doing great things with El Diablo as well. He calls it Eastside Vineyard. We call it El Diablo. But the wines are absolutely amazing, and they get better every year. I mean, we're working with 2 different selections of Chardonnay out of El Diablo. It's Old Wente clone from Hyde Vineyard and Montrachet Vineyard that came from somewhere, I don't know, on the other side of the Atlantic. I'm not sure exactly where.
We'll keep it, we'll keep it between you know,
Right.
Ulysses and
That's right. That's right.
there you go.
I don't want to get anybody into trouble, but no. So vineyard like that, where it's more of an unknown, it's more of a newcomer. It's really exciting to see something like that turn into one of these kind of all stars of the appellation. So that's an example of kind of two ways we look at, you know, those older vineyards that we're so fortunate to be working with, but they're long-standing, you know, Grand Cru sites for us in the Russian River Valley, compared to a new site that's more of a, I don't think it's a roll of the dice. It's definitely something that's carefully thought through before it's planted, but you never know what the ultimate potential of a young vineyard is until you start seeing the results, you know, many years after you plant it. So those are really exciting vineyards to watch.
Well, very cool. I know that we have gone way over time because we could talk about this all day long. Now, with something that we haven't mentioned or talked about is, you know, the 2018 is a bit of a heartbreaker, right? You know, in the sense that where you're opening up the new winery, the wines are coming in. That was also where we saw, you know, Ulysses, you know, pass in that fall. What are some of your thoughts, you know, about when that was going on, if you don't mind? But also, how do you see the transition and the next generation, and how you're working with those vineyards now that Ulysses is gone?
Yeah, it was very shocking when Ulysses passed away. You know, so yeah, I mean, it was middle of harvest, and yeah, the great thing about Ulysses was that no matter how famous he got, he was always the first guy to jump in an old truck and drive a couple bins over to a winery, or the first guy, if a picking crew was short a couple of guys, he would, you know, without hesitation jump in, and he would be, you know, the best picker in the whole crew, picking grapes at you know, his ripe old age of 49. Just unfortunately turns out, you know, he had a congenital heart, you know, defect, and so, you know, his father had passed away when Ulysses was 8 years old, suddenly, from a heart condition, and unfortunately it turns out, you know, we didn't know, but Ulysses had the same condition, and so just out of the blue, we lost him at, you know, 49 years old. You know, like I said, you know, he was the first guy to just drive a flatbed, if need be. He had actually come by the winery that evening that he died, to pick up a couple bins from me, and we had it. I'm glad we had this last moment because it was just he and I at the winery.
I'm sorry for bringing that.
That's okay. And so we had a couple beers. So it was cool. It was cool. But yeah, so, you know, the vineyards, you know, he was so good at identifying potential quality that the work he did, identifying, planting some of these sites that we now think of as these Grand Cru examples in the Russian River Valley and Sonoma Coast. You know, that work is kind of forever. I mean, those sites are with us now, and we get to benefit from the work he did going forward. So that's kind of the great thing, and the thing that you know, we can all hang on to, even though he's gone, is that we get to benefit from all the work he did in finding some of these amazing sites, planting them correctly, with amazing vine material so that they will last for 50, 60, 70 years. That the mark he made on the industry is absolutely, no one will ever forget that, and we get to benefit from that for decades to come.
Well, and that's why, for me, the 18 vintage is not only a beautiful vintage, but a profound one for a number of reasons. It reminds us of why we drink wine in the first place, and we look to specific producers because of their tie to the land. Is there anything that you want to tell everyone, out there, maybe when you're going to be able to come back out into the market and see a few people, or, what's next for you?
I would love that. I mean, we've all been cooped up for so long that now I'm really looking forward to getting out of wine country. It's hard, it's funny hearing myself say that. It's a nice spot, but no, I do want to get out, see all my friends in the wine industry across the country. We do have a little bit of a busy period coming up with harvest, but I think by all accounts, things are ramping at an insane rate right now, and that's great for all of us. I'm hoping by the time harvest settles down, thinking November, December timeframe, I'm ready to go back out and see all my favorite spots and see all my favorite people across the country. So yeah, I'm planning on it for sure.
Well, we can definitely have you out here to see some snow. How's about that?
Can't wait. I've been planning on that trip for forever now, so it needs to happen.
Well, very cool, my man. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, walking us through the vintages and, that personal story. It means so much. It's, I can't wait to have you out. If you do have any questions, guys, that are, watching this, don't hesitate to reach out to Matt, reach out to anyone at Wilson Daniels. And again, the 2018 wines they're not yet in the market. They're going to be in the market in the next 2 to 6 weeks, depending on how they're going to be divvied out to the country. So Matt, thanks again. Tell Mark and everybody I said, what's up? And again, good luck with the 21 harvest.
Great to talk with you, William. Thanks so much.
You too.
Okay.
Stay safe out there, guys. We'll see you soon.